Hi, I'm Jonathan Ward.
Hi, I'm Kimberly Lane.
And I'm Sonia and Jonathan. Together, we're unlocking leadership. We're three experienced executive coaches with very different disciplines. In every episode, we take a question from a real client and provide key insights to address their challenge from our three different perspectives. It's a holistic approach to address challenges and opportunities. Let's get to it. The question today is from Mylene in Helena, Montana. I'm supposed to give game-changing feedback to my peers. One of them has a congruency issue. He says one thing in words, but the body language says something else. How would you give game-changing feedback without damaging the relationship? Jonathan, what can Mylene share that helps this peer?
Well, thanks very much, Mylene, for that question. That's a great question. First of all, I was thinking, what kind of pressure is your organization putting on you to tell you that you are responsible for giving game-changing feedback to your peer? But at the same time, I think that is very possible for all of us to do. We do see things with people that we work with every day that can help them be better. And the assumption that we have here is that your peer is already doing his or her job very well, but might have some might have some things that would help them be even more effective in that role. So what I find is the best way to give feedback with something like this, where it's a behavioral issue that you're observing, is to use a specific example rather than saying you always do this or something like that. Is to use what we call the situation behavior impact model. In this specific situation, I saw you do this behavior and the impact that it had on me was X, Y, and Z. So this kind of depersonalizes it rather than saying, you're not trustworthy because you do this. That's really making it way too personal, which is going to put the person on defensive. But if what you might say instead is like last week when I came into your office, I had a real problem and I needed your help. And you said you were listening to me, but you sat there with your phone in your hand and you were typing and texting on your phone for 20 minutes while I was talking to you. You never made eye contact with me. As a result, I felt like you either weren't listening to me or what I was saying was not important. And so now you have some behavior that peer can focus on. If that's truly his intention, maybe what you were saying was not important, relative to other things that were going on. But the peer now is aware of that behavior and can say, let's talk about how we might change things. For example, if somebody comes into your office, instead of talking to them over your shoulder while you're still typing away at your monitor, if you turn your chair around and face that person directly, that makes it much more impactful. Presence statement with your body that you are actually listening to. Maybe you are listening to them when you're texting, but the person doesn't feel listened to. So again, using the situation, here's where this happened, here's the behavior I saw, and this is the impact it had on me, or this is the impact it had on people in the meeting. That kind of thing helps to depersonalize it and helps the person realize they can focus on changing a behavior. So Kimberly or Sonia, what do you think?
Well, sometimes it's, the first question is, do you believe your peer knows he or she has a challenge with this? Sometimes it's hard to provide feedback to people if they don't perceive they have a problem, right? It's kind of like, how does a psychiatrist change a light bulb? Well, the light bulb wants to change, right? So do they perceive they have a problem and do they want to change it? So that's kind of a double question there. So let's make the assumption that they are not aware, and kind of going to what Jonathan had expressed is that, I tend to go with try to putting yourself in the other person's shoes. So if, for example, if they're incongruent in what they're saying and how they're demonstrating their body language, you might begin by asking, have you ever noticed, do you ever feel like people don't understand what you're saying or feel confused about, confused about your intentions? Do you often feel misread? He or she may say no. Okay, so then the next step might be, instead of trying to be empathetic and being in their shoes and how they might feel, maybe then you go into the situational feedback that Jonathan talked about when you're having a conversation, is that, hey, just want to know, Jonathan, sometimes when we're working together, I often feel confused between what you're saying and your body language. For example, when you suggested that my idea out of the box idea for our project. You said you were really excited about it. Yet I felt when you crossed your arms and took a step back and weren't looking at me, I wasn't getting the same enthusiasm. So I'm just trying to understand which way is that, and help us moving forward for me to really understand what your intent is, right? So I think first find out again, one, do you believe they perceive they have this challenge by being empathetic and being in their shoes? And I think maybe they will be vulnerable enough to share with you that you can help them with that. Or then secondarily, this situation awareness piece that Jonathan and I just mentioned, where coming from a true example that you have experienced with that individual, that they can relax and reflect back on and possibly change their behavior. So what about you, Sonia?
So, in the culture that help us use it as a tool. So if in your organization, they already say, we're welcoming feedback and the feedback we want you to give us is one that's game changing, then you have something that you can lean into. Now, I'm going to suggest something, and you may or may not have an idea of something like this, but we tend to remember stories and images quite well. And so sometimes if there's like a movie that you all have that went to, or there's a video that's been recorded of a recent meeting or something like that, where you can both look at it, there's something about both of us looking at something and going, wow, I wonder what happened there. So something to think about. But I agree with Jonathan and with Kimberly that if the person is given an example, they'll have a better opportunity to do so. If you really don't want to damage the relationship, then you can, if you will, make up a story that has to do with you. And that you basically realized the other day that when you were talking to somebody and you were having a conversation with somebody that gets on your nerves, it's really, really difficult, and you were trying to be as open as possible, that you unconsciously crossed your arms and you unconsciously moved away from them. And has that ever happened to you? So if you use an example of something this person probably has experienced, you might be able to get them to sit there and go, yeah, I did have that happen. See, it happened to me because of blah, 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 blah. And then potentially you can go into that, because giving people feedback in which they can relate to something that is an unconscious thing that they do all the time requires for them to be able to register it. And when you tell them that this is what I experienced, if they value you and they think it's important and they don't want to hurt the relationship, they may choose to do something about it. But there's something about being able to go to a particular scene in a movie that everybody saw, or some event or something like that, where you're like, do you remember so and so did such and such? God, that was like, that to me was a real learning. And then the person can go, oh yeah, that's true. And because why is it that it's so important for us to have consistency between body language and what we say? Because because the brain at the base of the spine is always looking for, am I safe? And in the moment in which we see behavior that's different from what is being told, we immediately go into, I'm not safe, something's happening here, I'm not reading something correctly. And therefore, the person's not going to be able to engage or relate or do what they need to be doing from a place of confidence, security, being able to get it done.
I was just thinking one of the complexities that we layer onto is culture. As we start working in multinational organizations or working across national boundaries, that there are different expectations for how body language shows up in different places. So for example, if you made direct eye contact with somebody in China or Japan, you're going to make them feel extremely uncomfortable. In the US, if somebody's not looking you in the eye, then they're not a straight shooter, right? Or things like that. And so we have to be aware sometimes too that there might be a cultural component of things that are going on. Just to throw that in there.
Yeah, and then I was also thinking too, if you're supposed to give some game-changing feedback to a peer, and I don't know if that is coming, as Sonia mentioned, from leaders that specifically asking you to go give feedback to Sandra or Jerry, or this is an exercise that everybody is sitting in a room and pairing off, and each one has to experience game-changing feedback for the other, right? there's comfort in numbers, I guess, is what I'm getting to my point. So if there's a way to orchestrate this feedback such that you go to your peer and say, hey, I'm really feeling the need to work on some things. I was hoping maybe you could coach me on those and give me feedback. And are you okay if I do the same thing? Then it's a mutual thing. They're not being pointed out or feeling targeted, if you will, but it's kind of an exercise that you're bringing forward. And hey, we all have things to work on. You seem to be the person that you are trying to aspire to be a better version of yourself too. Would you be my partner in this exercise, right? And that gives you really a lot more vulnerability and opportunity to be vulnerable and to express what you're feeling, and maybe they would do the same thing.
That's fantastic.
And I agree with Jonathan about coming from a different culture, you're going to experience things differently. When I first came to the US and was in college, one day my roommate came into the room and she said, I just talked to somebody, Sonia, and they have you completely wrong. And I said, what do you mean? They said that you're very rude. You're very, very rude. And I'm like, really? Why? And she said, well, that you were walking down the, hallway the other day and they said hello to you and you didn't look at them. And I said, well, I haven't been introduced to them. And she said, what? I said, I haven't been introduced to them. So I'm not going to acknowledge that. And she said, you're in America. This is how we do it here. And so it was a huge, thing for me. It was like, oh, that's right. I am in a different culture. In my culture, that may be true. And as a woman, I may have thought that it was important to keep those defenses up, but not here if I want to fit in or I want to get to know people. So there is that providing context and bringing people into the room moment. And that was game changing for me. That was a game changing insight that I would have not done anything about and potentially had a reputation of being rude from that point forward.
Wow, that's insightful. Yeah. But now, I was just thinking too here, not even from a cultural perspective, but just, maybe from a cultural perspective, like when I work with a lot of Indians, they're not very comfortable in saying no, or I don't know the answer, or I'm not going to get it done, or it doesn't work. They're very agreeable, right? And you just find out later that they, well, have you finished the project? They missed the deadline, and you're like, what happened? And they just don't really give you much insight. I'm generalizing, obviously, but it's just they're afraid to assert themselves and say, you know what, this doesn't work on my timeline. I'm already, I can get to that in 3 weeks from now. They're just not trained on assertiveness, right? So I don't know with your peer in this particular instance how comfortable they are truly asserting how they feel and what they want to say, and therefore they're agreeable, but yet their body language is saying otherwise. So that might be a great opportunity from a coaching perspective too, just to kind of delve into that.
I'm just thinking some people are also very hypersensitive to body language, and they may be reading cues that aren't there. And I know, for example, that my wife is able to hear my eyes rolling from across the room, even if I'm not looking at her. So I have to learn to be very, very consistent about my behavior and make sure that it goes along with my actions.
So your eyes don't make any noise anymore?
No, I've learned to stop rolling my eyes even when we're not looking at each other.
That was that bowling ball sound that I heard the other day.
That is funny.
All right. Anything else? All right. Thank you, Mylene, for your question today. We hope you, our viewers and listeners, have a better understanding of how to deliver game-changing feedback. To our listeners, if you like the content we shared today, please like this episode and also share and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Unlocking Leadership -askthecoaches.com. We really look forward to reading your reviews. You can also find Unlocking Leadership -Ask the Coaches on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. If you have a leadership question for one of our coaches, please email us at info@unlockingleadership-askthecoaches.com. We would really love to hear from you. Thanks for joining us today. Tune in next time to find the keys to unlocking your best leadership.